I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I and anyone else who is here as settlers are here as the result of violence, conquest, and cultural genocide. I think an important part of an acknowledgement is tying it to the topics that will be discussed in an event, but I think for tonight, this acknowledgement is clearly the foundation of everything we will be talking about tonight. So I will finish with that and I will turn the stage over to Terry and Stephen.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Terry Gibbs, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all tonight for Politics of Hope. And first of all, before I do anything, I just wanted to give you some technical feeders. A couple of things to bear in mind so that you can fully enjoy the event. If you use the Zoom speaker view to watch the speakers that we're highlighting, if you'd like to ask a question, use the chat tool at the bottom of the screen. And we welcome all respectful and constructive comments on the chat during the social portions at the start and end of the session to receive your questions. And please note that while panelists are speaking, you'll only be able to direct your questions to our tech team, who will distribute your questions to commentators. And we apologize in advance that guests may not have the time to address all of your questions, but we really value your thoughts and ideas. So if there's things that come up that we don't address this evening, hopefully we'll be able to address them in future sessions. So bear that in mind. So on behalf of the Social Justice Project and Unama'ki College, and our very special co-sponsors this evening, the newly minted Unama'ki Cape Breton Climate Change Task Force, who are co-sponsoring the event. And our other co-sponsors, the School of Arts and Social Sciences at CBU, the Cape Breton Partnership, Planet Citizen, Peace Quest Cape Breton, and the Animal Ethics Project. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome you all to this gathering this evening. And we're especially grateful to the guests who have come, elders and knowledge keepers, educators, activists, scientists, lawyers, and I'm really grateful here to be on stage with my co-host and friend, Elder Stephen Augustine. So just to say a little bit about the series, Politics of Hope, and the idea sort of came about when just as we were heading into COVID, and we've been doing this series during the COVID pandemic with the thought that people are feeling a real sense of urgency around a lot of really critical issues, colonialism in particular, as people talk about decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation, and people are confused about the terms, people want to know what to do. Climate change, and we have in the background racism, sexism, all those things going on. And I think people are really feeling a sense that when we come out of COVID, let's look at this world in a different way. Let's not go back to business as usual. And if one thing we can say about COVID is that it's really helped us, probably everyone, to recognize our collective vulnerability and our interdependence. And that we really should move forward with that sense of looking at what is best for all of humanity, for all of the living creatures, and for our earth. And as Monika said, when we looked at the series, we wanted to really start Politics of Hope with grounded in the unceded territory here, Mi'kmaq territory, and to really look at that question. And I know for people right now, with today's decision coming down about the fisheries, and all the questions are burning in people's minds and will likely be top and front and center for people who are coming here tonight. And for myself, I was just at an event last night that was honoring the life of Berta Cáceres, who was an Indigenous Honduran water protector and land protector who became quite internationally renowned and was assassinated 5 years ago. And her life really kind of brings into perspective the fact that for a lot of people who are on the front lines of these struggles, it actually literally is life and death, protecting the land and protecting it in for the good of all of us. And the inspiration for this particular episode in Politics of Hope, Defending the Defenders, Treaties, Indigenous Knowledge, and Solidarity in a Time of Climate Crisis. I was having a conversation with my colleague and friend, Matt Hern, who's on this panel today, who is what we might say an expert on global warming and climate change, and has done all kinds of good research around that, and what the role of settlers and allies could be in supporting the process of decolonization. And I said to him, what's the most important thing we could do to think about climate change? And he said, supporting Indigenous rights, Indigenous land claims. And for some of us, that's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But I think for a lot of folks, they don't necessarily make that connection or really understand what that even means. So I thought, wow, this is something we need to talk about collectively. And really explore that. So tonight, I'm really excited with the panel that we have and with the commentators that we have to really kind of get into the nitty gritty of that and talk about it. So what we will do is I will introduce my friend, Stephen, and just to say a couple of words about Stephen, there's always the official stuff that you say. Stephen is hereditary chief on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, and he also is a colleague of mine at Cape Breton University. He is the associate vice president, Indigenous Affairs and Unama'ki College at Cape Breton University. But I also know Stephen as a brilliant historian, a thinker, a writer, and a lot of our conversations outside of work are around those sorts of things. And when I listen to Stephen and he tells the creation story and other stories, I learn something new every time, and he is a great inspiration to me. So to have him here and co-hosting with me tonight, thank you, Stephen, for agreeing to do that. And it's my great pleasure to have you with me for this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to co-host with you in this marvelous session. And I wanted to introduce you as well. And I have to read something because I can't remember everything that's so great about Terry Gibbs. She's a settler of Welsh and English descent, although she aspires to be a global citizen. She is a mother, educator, and social justice activist. She has lived all over Turtle Island and has spent time living and working around the world in various countries of Latin America, Sub-Sahara Africa, East Asia, Eastern Europe, and in Palestine. Since 2004, she has taught international politics at Cape Breton University with a focus on social justice issues. Through her life experience and travels, Terry has developed a deep commitment to making connections, local to global, and building bridges between various movements and communities. This has involved many years of experiential learning and teaching in the process of educating for social change. Prior to entering the university system, she spent many years working in the nonprofit sector, both in Canada and internationally, and she continues to be involved in community works and social justice activism. She's also a homeschooler. She's educated 2 young boys and that are entering into post-secondary school system, and I'm so proud of her for doing that. Also, this discussion this evening, I mean, for me, being given the responsibility, I guess, inheriting the creation story, it's at least my family's version of a Mi'kmaq creation story. Life kind of begins with Mother Earth, and everything that we obtain from Mother Earth is negotiated through our ceremonies. We every time we are doing ceremony, we are giving thanks to Mother Earth for providing us with all the necessities of life, and so we get from the birds, plants, animals, and fish, we get our food and medicine, clothing, shelter, tools of survival, and how we travel about on the top of Mother Earth. And so in a modern context, I mean, you look at today, it's the federal government that took over the responsibility when they stopped us from roaming all over Mother Earth and obtaining the necessities of life that we needed from her. So the government now provides us with our food and our medicine, our tools of survival, which is education, travel. So all the things that we could obtain with our own sovereignty, we're at the hands of government today, and we're depending on court cases and legal analysis. to get where we go. So anyway, not to hold up the conference any longer, I want to introduce Bree and Monika. Bree Menge is a mother of four. I got to get this right now. 2 biologically and 2 blended. That's pretty neat. A proud Mi'kmaq woman living in Eskasoni First Nation. She is currently employed at CBU in Unama'ki College, and her passion is advocacy for her Mi'kmaq people and Indigenous peoples, and how we can all live as treaty people. How we can all live as treaty people. Monika Dutt is a settler. She's Unama'ki. She's a daughter of immigrants. I met her dad and her son, public health and family physician, and mother of a 9-year-old son. So beautiful young family, and I'm happy that she came back from Toronto to Unama'ki. Bilaliet, Monika, thank you. So back to Terry.
Yes, we're doing a little ping pong back and forward. I'm so excited to have Bree and Monika with us tonight. The commentators always bring something, and just knowing a bit about the commitment of both of them in the community work that they do, the political work that they do, the activism that they do. It's a real honor to have them as our commentators. And now, with no further ado, to move to our speakers for this evening, our absolutely exciting panel of folks here. And I'll start by talking about my colleague, Tuma Young and friend. We're both in the Department of Ilnu Political and Social Studies at CBU together, although we don't get to see each other enough. And I finally pinned him down for a coffee tomorrow, so we'll be able to debrief. But Tuma is an Ilnu Mi'kmaq from Malagawach First Nation, and his band is Eskasoni First Nation. He was born into the Atuij, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Squirrel Clan, for the Aflik Jumuj Rabbit Clan, and this, you can correct my pronunciation afterwards. He is the spouse of Nicholas Honig and resides in Sydney River, where he teaches Mi'kmaq studies at Cape Breton University. He is the first Ilnuisit fluent Mi'kmaq speaking lawyer called to the bar in Nova Scotia. It's a historic moment. Congratulations, Tuma. We're also very, very proud of you. And the incoming president there for 21-22. So that's quite amazing when one of our own kind of marks this historic moment. So very exciting. And then just moving along, Matt Hern, who is also a colleague and teaches by distance on our MBA program. And he lives in Richmond, BC on Musqueam territory. He's the co-founder and co-director of Solid State Community Industries and has led many other community projects. He teaches with multiple universities and continues to lecture globally, and his books and articles have been translated into 17 languages. His most recent books are What a City is For, Remaking the Politics of Displacement, Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, and On This Patch of Grass, City Parks on Occupied Land. It's not mentioned here in the bio that I got, but I also know that Matt does a lot of wonderful work with youth and is an inspiring person who is modeling a lot of what he believes in his activities with youth. And that's something that is dear to my heart. So thanks for all that good work, Matt, and we're really happy to have you here. And last, but certainly not least, the wonderful Dorene Bernard. Such a privilege to have you come and spend an evening with us. I know how busy your life is and all the important work that you do. She's the Mi'kmaq grassroots grandmother. And I love that you put that up front, grandmother. It's wonderful. A water protector, water walker, and survivor of the Indian residential school system. She was the Coady Chair on Social Justice in 2017, focusing on education on Indigenous issues, treaty rights, environmental racism, climate justice, Indian residential schools, and reconciliation. She volunteers in social justice work, missing and murdered Indigenous women, environmental racism and protection of the water, cultural teachings, and water ceremony. She was participant in There's Something in the Water documentary on environmental racism in Nova Scotia. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. It's a groundbreaking film and absolutely eye-opening. I show it to all my students and make sure that they show it to their families, but just really grounds us in the reality of ongoing, the history of colonialism and the ongoing practices and structural violence that still are part of our communities and societies, and that we hope through these kinds of events that we can begin to break down and transform and move to some kind of resurgence of something more hopeful and positive as we work together on this land. So on that note, I will turn the floor over to you, Dorene. You need to unmute yourself, my dear.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I just was a little nervous following these awesome panelists and the people, responsible for this event. And I'm really humbled to be here to share. So I'd like to speak about the Indigenous knowledge, the teachings that I have learned, and how I practice these teachings that are part of my life journey, healing journey. The knowledge that I have gained from my lived experience, the ancestral memory of the historic trauma of colonization, the experiences at residential school, and our continued resistance of environmental racism, oppression, and the infringement on our treaty rights, and the impacts on our families and communities in our nation. So I became involved in the protection of the water about, I would say, 2007 is when I started noticing grandmother Josephine Mandelman, who was a Mother Earth water walker, who was walking around the Great Lakes. And I discovered her like online, I didn't know who she was. And I began to support her work by educating people in Mi'kmaq through doing one-day water walks in Point Pleasant Park and just around Mi'kmaq, just to talk about the work that she was doing and the teachings that she passed on to the world, about the sacredness of water and what was happening on Mother Earth and the need for people to wake up, So in 2007, we started doing those walks. And then little did I know that was preparing me for what was going to happen, in our own territory, to our own water, and what was happening, around us. And so that's how things got started. And, those teachings with the women's teachings, and about our role as water protectors. And when I started to gather the women together and talk about, what our role is as women and protecting the water, people really embraced those teachings. And we wanted to share that it was our shared responsibility to protect the water and all life that needs clean water to live. And the life, culture, and strength of the Indigenous people cannot be separated from the sacredness of water. We embrace our connection to Mother Earth and her lifeblood, and encourage all people to remember that water is precious, and every living being depends on it to survive. Water must be defended at all costs because water is life. Many of our Indigenous ceremonies and rituals, as Stephen was saying, and of course, we include water. The sweat lodge ceremony, the Sundance ceremony, we go without food and water for 4 days when you dance. And that first drink of water when you start that ceremony, and after 4 days, that first drink of water that you get to come back from spirit, from that dance, gives you life, and how much you appreciate the water, and how much you love the water. That song that was sung just before we started is an Anishinaabe song, water song, that was created by the women water walkers. And what it's saying is, water, I love you. Water, I respect you. Water, I thank you. Water is life. We have many women's ceremonies as well that include the water, the moon ceremony, healing ceremonies, the water ceremonies, of course, and the water walk, and many more. So water is central to many of our ceremony and our teachings. Our teachings that women have been given a sacred gift to carry new life in the womb. Surrounded by water, we drink the water, we breathe the water, we are the water. We are over 60% water. When we come into the world, we come through the water to take our first breath of air, carrying that spirit of the water inside of us. We are spiritual beings living a human experience. Women have also been given that responsibility to protect the water and Mother Earth for the life they bring into the world, as well as to be the voice for the life that does not have a voice, to ensure life for the future generations. Women often are on the front line to protect the water against industrial pollution and destruction of lands. There's a direct correlation to the industrial destruction of Mother Earth and the violence against Indigenous women around the world. The many missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, men, and boys. Many have been murdered and have gone missing while standing on the front lines in front of industry and military and governments to defend the sacred. Many men have also died while defending the women and children in their communities. We have been witness to these atrocities around the world caused by industry and governments that only see our Mother Earth and waters as commodities. The resource extraction, the destruction of the land and water and people, animals, and all life are their collateral damage and inconvenience, expendable to their quest for wealth and greed. We are at a crossroads where every human being is called to solidarity with peoples across Turtle Island, whose waters and lands are at risk to industrial contamination, fossil fuel industry, infrastructure, climate change, and state laws and violence that puts people's lives at risk in the past, the present, and the future. We call on everyone to stand up and take actions for what is right and just for the health of our environment and all life that depend on the lands and the water to survive. This climate crisis is not just an Indigenous issue. It is a human issue. It is the survival for all living beings issue. There are many ways for you to become involved in the protection of the environment, the water, and climate justice right here in Mi'kmaq. Raise awareness of the need for environmental justice and clean water for all life. We ask people to to do this ceremony in the morning or at night before you go to bed. Put this glass of water, a cup of water like this, beside you so that it can hear your dreams, hear your thoughts, feel your emotions. This water knows you, it feels you. In the morning when you wake up, you take this glass of water and you tell the water, I love you. Guess how? I love you. I thank you. I respect you. Water is life. You ask this water to be your medicine, your first medicine for the day. Go to your mind, body, spirit, emotion, wherever you need that help to carry you through the day in a good way. It's a way of you to start your relationship, begin a sacred relationship with the water. Share that with your family, your friends, you know, in your circles, and pray for the water. Pray for the healing of the water, the protection of the water, in your own way, or however it is that you connect. Participate in Mi'kmaq water walks. We will be having another one in the spring. We have one every year to walk in ceremony, carry the water and pray. We've been walking for the water, and now there's water walks across Turtle Island to pray and to raise awareness about the sacredness of water and the need for its protection. And you can, support, educate, walk the water if you'd like, honor the water that you rely on to live, celebrate and stand up to protect your own watershed, the source of your clean water. Remember peoples across Mi'kmaq and Canada whose water is at risk to industrial contamination, and learn ways to support them. Pictou Landing First Nation, dealing with both harbor and the cleanup for over 50 years of industrial pollution. And now the unacceptable plan for use of containment cells to store the toxic contamination on site instead of the complete cleanup and restoration of the land and water and environment at Aseg as promised. These are really important for people to stand up for the community and what they need and what should happen to clean up Aseg. The Shaw Sand and Gravel Mine adjacent to Indian Brook has been mined in aggregate off the top of our aquifer for over 55 years, and they have a 99-year lease. They're going to continue, and they have permits from the Nova Scotia government environment to expand. The risk to our natural spring and community water source, our lands, the air, on our health from silica dust and contaminants is immense, and it needs to stop. We need to do something. We need that help and support to protect our water, our aquifer. This aquifer supplies water for many communities surrounding Indian Brook. The Mi'kmaq and non-Indigenous communities in the Sibbaganagadi River watershed continue to oppose fossil fuel industry infrastructure, where Alton Gas proposes to mine salt to create 18 massive underground storage caverns. After years of resistance and court challenges, consultation with Sibbaganagadi has yet to take place. Yet they are in this project since 2003. And here we are, still waiting for consultation. It's, our laws, our provincial environmental laws and our federal laws to protect the environment and the species, the fish and the species failed our people, failed this environment, the river, and it's we can't allow them to make new regulations to allow this to happen. So that's the only open they have now, is to amend the environmental acts, that that protect the water from deleterious substances dumped in our river, and that will kill our fish. They can amend those to allow, just like they allowed Boat Harbor, just how they allowed, made their own rules to allow this to happen. We can't let them continue to do that. After years of resistance and court challenges, we are where we are today. Oil and gas still has to permit to dump, thousands and thousands of many thousands of tons of salt brine into our water, infringing on our treaty rights to fish and impacting all the life that depend on the water, that watershed. Our water in Indian Brook comes from the Shubenacadie River. That feeds into our the watershed that supplies all water for all our communities surrounding. We are still standing on the front lines to protect the water today. We have women that have been arrested for standing up, and they are still before the courts. Many treaty rights holders in our communities, grassroots, grandmothers, water protectors, have not been consulted on the Goldboro LNG export terminal project. It is the head of the snake, to me, connected to the Alton gas project, the belly of the snake. And we do not consent to the 5,000 man camp construction or the Mi'kmaq involvement in providing hospitality services to this camp. We know that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report on the high statistics of missing and murdered Indigenous women in correlation to the energy and extractive industries in Canada and the US, where these man camps are located. This fossil fuel industry is dependent on fracked gas and will open Mi'kmaq to fracking and more destruction to the water in the future. We are not against development of renewable, sustainable energy that support climate justice and addresses climate crisis in Mi'kmaq. Educate yourselves about this fuel project and the impacts it will have on communities, our environment, and climate change. Across Canada, where Indigenous communities do not have clean access to clean drinking water, some for over 20 years, find a way to support their basic human right to clean water, clean land, and resources to survive. Think about what legacy we are leaving behind for the future generations to survive on Mother Earth, and do whatever we can, whatever you can, to help and support the changes that are needed for a healthy and sustainable environment. We also, I want to mention my sisters and brothers in New Brunswick, where they are in opposition of the open pit tungsten mine, and how they had been standing on the front lines in the middle of nowhere, trying to protect their lands and their water as well. I think I just wanted to say a little bit about our treaty rights to fishing and our treaty rights to our lands and our waters. And I think we are in for the fight of our lives to protect our treaty rights, to assert our treaty rights, and our right to self-determination. Thank you.
Walali Dorene Well, dasi, dapat well oistune. Am sa ko was good man some kana. Am sa tali ay usually manata niya dali want to meet. Thank you very much, Doreen, for that wonderful presentation on water, the importance of water, the ceremonies, the indigenous knowledge, the battles that have been going on and that have gone on and are continuing to go on. So it's my job briefly to um, let you know a little bit about myself. I mean, well, Terry introduced me. First of all, I find that one of my weaknesses is that as I look over and I see all the folks here, and I don't really know a lot of people, but you get to know who I am. So if you ever run across me or something like that, and you say hello, how are you? And if I draw a blank face, that's something in my head. I can remember a conversation from 10 years ago, word for word, but I will forget your name. You know, that's and I will mispronounce it. So when Terry was talking about trying to pronounce some of the stuff in my bio, and I was like, oh well, I do that all the time too, so don't worry about that. When Terry asked me to do this, I said, well, what is it that you want me to talk about? I can talk about a lot of things, really. I can talk about law, I can talk about culture, I can talk about history, I can talk about and gossip about everybody else too. So, I mean, she said the theme is defending the defenders, the climate change and indigenous knowledge and the climate crisis. Well, as I sat there and I thought about it in preparation for this, and I said, well, there's only a little bit of time we have. I'm like, what exactly can I say about defending the defenders? Well, I think I want to acknowledge all those defenders who are defending the defenders. Every one of us participates. Every one of us are an ally. Every one of us is a treaty beneficiary. Every one of us has treaty obligations and everything. But every one of us has different roles, different obligations, different places where we all run in different circles. Some of us are in all sorts of circles and others are things. I'm just reminded, I just before I came on, there was a little note that came up to me. I read the news from today about the minister or DFO of fishery, and it often feels like, what is it, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, right? No, but at least we're still going ahead in some ways. And that may be the optimistic in me. And then I just before we came on, I got the notice from Senator Dan Christmas and his news release and how disappointed he was. So I think to myself, every one of us has an obligation to to make the world a better place. And the climate change and climate crises and the environmental activism that we all do here in some form or fashion, we're all working for the same goal. Now, in some ways, how do we get to that same goal? And our goal is to make the world a better place, the environment a healthier place, right? Every single one. I've never known anybody do it, but each of us does it a slightly different way. Some of us are grassroots, down in the trenches, activism, barricades, everything like this. And I seen the Vancouver Police Department break up at a protest down in the streets there of activists, right? And I think, well, what is it that we know as Indigenous people, as Unnu people, and our Unnu Dasi, what can we say to help you, and do this fight, to strategize, to work together? And there's not much I can say really, except, we do have information that would be very, very helpful and useful, And I'm just reading off a little tiny speaking notes. I don't have a speech here, but these are my speaking notes. So I just don't want to forget everything. Doreen talked about treaty rights. We have the peace and friendship treaties. We have the Hudson-Robson treaties. We have the numbered treaties. And yes, we have the modern day agreements, such as the James Bay Cree Northern Inuit agreements, the Yukon self-government agreements, the umbrella agreements, Nisga'a agreements, Tsawwassen agreements, and we have treaty rights. But I often, people who know me also know that I often speak about our treaty obligations. You know, corresponding with each right, we have a corresponding obligation. And so when we hear governments and folks in bureaucracies talking about, and these folks are also probably wanting to do the right thing too, they talk about, we are all treaty people. These treaties all belong to us. Well, we also have treaty, not only do our treaty rights, but there are treaty obligations. And part of it is a treaty diplomacy. You know, I wrote an article on it for the Treaty Education Office on treaty diplomacy. And I'm going to tell you a little, there's two particular, I'm just trying to get it all close because I know I only have got a few minutes. One of them is that there's this phrase we probably all hear, bury the hatchet. Well, that was an actual ceremony that was done during the signing of the treaties. But it wasn't just bury the hatchet was buried along with the sword. And there's at least two places that the note says. One is that it was either buried at the lieutenant governor's house, or in front of the courthouse on Spring Garden Road, or in Mulgrave Park. There was at that something place, by a spring. The other ceremony that impacts upon treaty diplomacy is the Ulnus, especially those from Pictou Landing, when they came down to adhere to the treaty and they presented themselves, they washed their faces of the war paint. All Ulnus, we washed that war paint off as a sign of our commitment to the peace and friendship treaties. And we have never put that war paint back on. No. Despite all the effects of colonization, despite all the effects of traumatization, we have kept the treaty promises because that's how attached we are, that's how sacred they are, that's embedded in all of what we do. And I just want, when I do treaty education things, I tell everybody, including non-Native people, all other Nova Scotians, all other Canadians, you too have a treaty and you too have treaty obligations. And so in climate change, in climate crisis, in the environmental work that we all do, we have diplomacy as part of the activism that we have to do. So going back to a foundational knowledge, there are Aboriginal rights and there are treaty rights. Those are two different things. Sometimes they overlap, they intersect and everything, but Aboriginal rights are, in a nutshell, those are those rights that existed prior to colonization. Prior to the French, the English, the Basques, the Vikings, before they arrived, Aboriginal rights. And they continue to exist and they continue to be recognized by the Constitution. Treaty rights are those rights that are enshrined in treaties. That's not necessarily after colonization. There's many treaties that existed prior to it, in different forms of it. So, and Ulnus, we have a foundational scientific knowledge about Gimitkinook, our land. And that's one of the words that I want people to start using, Gimitkinook. People will say Maramigo, Sitramu, others, but in the treaty diplomacy languages, it was Gimitkinook. It says this is our land, our attachment, and our sacredness to it, right? And it also includes the biodiversity that's on this land, between the plants, the flora, the fauna, the animals, the water, everything, the biodiversity in it. This foundational knowledge, this scientific knowledge that's Ulnu-based, is held and is expressed in our worldview. Our worldview, Ilnui Dasim, is expressed in many different ways. Languages, songs, ceremonies, chants, dances, rituals, history, oral knowledge. Those are just a few. But significant amounts of it is contained in the language. So one of the things of defending the defenders in the environmental activism or climate crisis that we are facing, one of the strongest things that we need to do is to support and uphold the language, because a lot of those worldview principles, protocols, ceremonies, etc., are embedded there. Like for example, when I say Gimitkinook, it means something much more stronger than Mahamigo or land or anything like that. Gimitkinook is our where we sprout from, what Saliadi, or, there's many things about it. So it's important to include as part of our activism, learning the language. And I'm at a point where I tell people, even if you're non-natives, learn the new language. Try anyway, do it, make an effort, learn it. And I know it's going to be hard on those, we say that settlers should not be learning on from the indigenous people. Well, we got to do it somehow. So let's do it anyway. So I tell people, once that language is extinct, significant amount of that knowledge becomes extinct, and we're losing it very fast. That vast biodiversity knowledge that's found within it would also become extinct. And we need to have that biodiversity scientific knowledge to help us address the climate crisis that we are in. Thus, our protection needs, and defending the defenders means defending the language speakers and promoting Inuit Dasing. So now we turn to the next part. Impsid mi majuahan is a word that I use. Impsid mi majuahan, all life. In whatever form, fashion, it is, needs to be protected. It's part of our treaty obligation. It's part of the treaty diplomacy that we all engage in when we, encounter other life forms, whether it's an animal, whether it's a moose, a deer, or a eagle, or a frog, or a tadpole, or an insect, a bee, whatever, a fungi, bacteria. Yes, even COVID-19 is a virus, and there's a life force to it, and we have to encounter it. What's our treaty diplomacy? What's our treaty obligations to it, right? So that's why I say, foundational scientific knowledge is about all mi majuahan. So some of these expressions are rooted in our Aboriginal rights, and they're also rooted in our inherent rights, of the Innu people, and they're written throughout in the interpretation principles of the peace and friendship treaties, right? So, what are some of these? The ones that immediately come to mind with everybody is that we have a right to life, the right to food, right to subsistence, we have to, and in the treaties, we have that famous phrase, the right to necessaries. That's an interesting one. And yes, to commercial rights. Donald Marshall Jr. did not go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and he fought for the right to commercial, to sell the right to, to sell the fish. But at no time did they ever say moderate livelihood. That came back from the court. That wasn't Junior. The right was to commercially sell it. So, and on those treaties, you also have to look at, it's not just about hunting and fishing and etc. type of thing. There's also about adjudication. What happens in these disputes when we argue about pipelines, when we argue about water, when we present our court challenges, our things? The treaties outline what the adjudicative processes are supposed to be. We have them. How are we going? And with those disputes and those treaty rights to those adjudicated bodies, we also, and when I say we, I think it's the royal we, both the settlers and the indigenous peoples here, the royal we here. We have obligations under those treaties. In regards to dispute mechanisms. And our primary obligation is to take care of Gmitkinuk. Above everything else, that's our primary obligation. I guess you can say it's like the Star Trek tree, the prime directive or something like that, right? No, so that's what we have. Our prime obligation is to take care of Gmitkinuk, our land. And on the land, there are different worlds. Now, when you look at these stories, there are different worlds, Sitkamu, Mahamigo, Misigis, Skadeg, all these words, there's about 6 or 8 different worlds. And as you journey through life, you go through all these various worlds and you encounter life forces in all of them. And The protocols, the rules, the indigenous legal principles is how you're supposed to behave when you encounter these other life forces. You know, some of these worlds are big, some of these worlds are huge, some of them are tiny, microscopic. But we, you know, when you embark upon your journey and you leave the particular world, you go to another world, you're given those rules and protocols as to when you encounter them. And that's the edges of these worlds is where some of these most powerful places are. No. So we have an obligation to take care of each other. That's what our treaties are all about. Their relationship. How do we take care of each other? How do we live with each other? How do we share this commitment? No. And these obligations expand to all the life forces, not just between humans. We have obligations to take care of the trees, fungi, insects, animals, the birds, and yes, to take care of COVID-19 too. No, that's a life force too. And, you know, and the tiny ones. So these trees, oh, 1 minute left. Oh my God. Okay. So I'm going to wrap it up very quickly then, you know, that these treaties are all about how to establish, maintain, and renew our relationships with each other. This model can be used for our environmental activism and to address the climate change. You know? Thus, when we think about the question about what is our treaty rights and obligation from the UNO perspective, you know, the first step is think about it in terms of relationships among all life forces and how they connect with each other, including our own as humans. One thing we often forget is that we humans are part of the environment too, and the environment is part of us. No, we're not separate and apart. So just setting things aside with no human activity is not the answer either. We are part of the environment. So you can find these rules, protocols, and guiding principles in our life force, in our Louis document. The last thing is, you know, I think we all educate. Many of us are, we all have a foundational knowledge. Some of us are starting out. Some of us need cultural competency to cultural, you know, we need to move to cultural healing, reconciliation. Yes, you hear that word tossed around a bit, but we need to move to decolonization. And so these different communities, such as race, sex, gender, orientation, disability, everything, you know, everybody wants to learn about all these communities of places like this. We need to also start thinking about the climate crisis and the environmental activism. So we need to also help others become culturally competent and move towards decolonization in the environmental activism movement and how to best address climate change. So, and one of the greatest ways, Dorene touched upon this and she triggered this a little bit, is that maybe we need to also think about trauma-informed climate activism, because climate crisis is a trauma inflicted on all of us. Okay, with that, I am going to pass it over to Matt. Go ahead, Matt. Well, thank you. I will allow you.
Thanks so much for that, Tim. Much appreciated. I want to say first, thanks for having me, y'all. Much appreciated. It's nice to see everybody. And I want to say thanks to everybody who organized the event. So Catalina, Suvir, Terry, everybody else who I don't know who made this thing possible. Thanks a lot. And thanks to fellow panelists and speakers. So that's Stephen, Tuma, Dorene, Terry, you two, Bree, Monika to come. I feel kind of honored to be included. And thanks for everybody else who's here hanging out with us, taking the time out of your day. So I am here in Surrey, British Columbia. And that is the traditional and the unceded territory of the Semiahmoo, the Kaiket, the Tsawwassen, the Katsi, the Musqueam, the Coquitlam, and the Kwantlen, all peoples who shared this land. And in some way, I'm also, in some way I'm not sure, it feels like I'm on Mi'kmaq territory too. I don't know how that would work, but I'm gonna feel like I'm there with you anyways. And I guess also it should be said, if it's not clear to you now, that I'm a white guy settler, and I grew up on Vancouver Island, on Sakem territory, and I'm a 4th generation settler. My great-grandfather arrived here via the shipping trade to North Vancouver onto Squamish territory. And I am of a still somewhat unclear to me mix of Irish, French, and English backgrounds. Some of which maybe I'll try to clear up in some ways, but people speak of me as mostly Irish, and I'm happy to take it for now. And I am, it is true, and thank you for the kind introduction, Terry. It is true that I do some teaching in universities, but not really. Honestly, that's a very much a side hustle. My primary avocation, and has been for the last 35 years, is as a community organizer, and primarily working with young people. And for the last 7 years, I've run a project that I co-founded and co-directed with some great colleagues of mine called Solid State Community Industries. And we start workers co-ops with young people from racialized migrant backgrounds. And with any luck, we have plans to start a hub in Sydney sometime in the near future. So I'm hoping to be able to expand that, and then maybe I'll be able to spend more time in a place that's actually very dear and near to my heart. To spend more time on Mi'kmaq territory would be a joy. And I do a little bit of writing here and there. In 2015, I started working on a book with two of my closest friends and colleagues, a guy called Amarjad Johal, who is my closest colleague and pal who we work on a lot, and a guy called Joe Sacco, who's a well-known cartoon journalist. And so in some ways, I'm going to be representing here, I'm going to be representing and talking about this book called Global Warming and the Sweetness of Living. And I'm going to be representing my friends and colleagues here as well. So if you hear something here that you really like, that's the part that I wrote. If you hear something that you don't like, you disagree with, that's the part that Am and Joe wrote, and you can take that up with them. Maybe I can just speak a little bit about it and about where it came from and what we started digging up. And in a lot of ways, the project is to try to pull together and try to link and understand the ongoing logics of displacement and dispossessions, and of ongoing, colonial depredations, and to understand them as part of, in fact, the foundations of our thinking about global warming. And a lot of our work was to try to rethink ecology, to try to think through like an affirmative vision of change and a material future. And we kept returning to this idea of sweetness of life, or a sweetness of living, as a way to try to think about a living alternative to the contemporary kind of buffeting of incredible anxiety and volatility and death that seems to subsume so much of our thinking, in particular around climate change, around global warming, and certainly around ecology in general. And much of our motivation was around kind of a generalized weave of frustration and anger, of fury, at thinking about ecology, but of global warming specifically, and the ongoing kind of accelerating and alarming evidence, counterposed with the paucity of real substantive action. And certainly that was echoed in my own life, in our own lives, which is to say that I do believe in global warming. I understand the gravity and the urgency of thinking about ecology in new ways. And yet the cold reality is that, and I will tell you this honestly, friends, is that I do not do that much to change my life substantively. And I see that echoed by so many people in my, that I know, that we believe in the necessity of real and fundamental change, and yet oftentimes are thwarted, that oftentimes issues of global warming seem like something beyond our reach and our scope, that there's something that governments have to take on, or those are multinational, agreements that are, and that the kind of everyday activity that we try to, the changes we try to make, we try to ride our bikes or drive less or fly less, they seem insubstantive, and not scaled to the scope of the problem. And so, and yet the math of global warming is really clear and has been agreed upon essentially since the 1970s. The science is unequivocal, that, and Canada's responsibility is even starker, that 85% of the Canadian oil and gas resources have to be left in the ground if we were going to do anything like our part to ameliorate global warming. And yet so often in this country, and certainly in this part of the world, the air sort of gets taken out of that conversation. It feels like the wind is sucked out of the room in some ways. And Justin Trudeau, who in many ways is seen as internationally as one of the most progressive or at least putatively progressive leaders in the world, he said in 2018, he said, there isn't a country in the world, and I'm quoting here, there isn't a country in the world that would find billions of barrels of oil and leave it in the ground while there's a market for it. And then in the face of that kind of thinking, it's trying to think through, like, well, what do you do with that then? If that's it, then how could we possibly go from here? And so to try to shake up our thinking, Am and Joe and I schemed up this idea of going on a trip to the tar sands. And because we live on the west coast of Canada, where we have a very direct and very prescient everyday kind of relationship with the tar sands in all kinds of ways, and certainly not the least of which of pipelines running directly through this territory, and that we have a very intimate relationship with the tar sands of Alberta, not the least of which there are huge numbers of people that leave this land and go and work in northern Alberta on Treaty 6, but primarily on Treaty 8 territory to make their livings. And we kind of got a bit of an opportunity when one of my daughters decided to go work in one of the camps in 2015. She was a young woman who joined our family as a teenager and spent most of her 20s trying to reorganize her life and think through. And many of her friends, she'd been working in bars and working in restaurants, and she needed a change. And many of her friends had gone to work up in Fort Mac. And so she went up there in 2015 to try to shake her life up, but unequivocally, really to try to make some money, to try to change what she was up to. And so it kind of offered me and Am and Joe an opportunity because she and a bunch of her friends were up there. So we had a place we could go and land and a kind of an endpoint. And what we found when we first got there, we went up to in 2015, was something really unexpected in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, our trips to Fort Mac, and when we carried on doing those trips, we went twice in 2015 and then 2 or 3 times, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. We've continued to go back and forth to northern Alberta. We traveled first to Fort Mac, and then we traveled all through Cree and Dene territory, all through Treaty 8, meeting with all kinds of friends and activists and benefiting from the hospitality and generosity of all kinds of people. And our notion was to try to actually see and meet people and to spend time and to see with our own eyes the tar sands and to see what extractive industry looked like up close and to talk to people, including my daughter and many of her friends, all young Black and brown women who were finding work and finding possibility that they had, in many cases, never found before. And what we found in places like Fort Mac was startling. I don't know if anybody here has been to Fort Mac, but it's an amazing place in a lot of ways. It's an unbelievably diverse spot. There are people like any spot in the world with like a boomtown, but there are people from all over the world that are finding opportunity that they had never conceived possible. People who are coming from every corner of the world, people who are bringing families here, people who are putting kids through university, people who are buying houses, and a place that was remarkable in many ways to us. And a place that in many ways, I have to tell you that I actually have, I have a lot of fondness for. I have a lot of fondness, and every time I go to Fort Mac, I'm really interested. And yet, at the same time, that really interesting, diverse community that is, in fact, benefiting all kinds of working people is happening unequivocally, unapologetically in many cases on stolen Indigenous territory, and making impossible lives, traditional lives that have been lived there since time immemorial. That really, in many ways, through the entire northern part of Alberta and all through Treaty 8, that hunting, that fishing, that trapping, that traveling is just untenable because of the unbelievable scale of industrial depredation. It's and we were not interested in going there to indulge in some kind of enviro porn. But the scope and scale of the devastation is like, it is really remarkable in all kinds of ways. and more than that, that kind of relationship, that relationship between a place that is unequivocally contributing to global warming in a way that James Hansen, who is often considered one of the primary kind of ongoing experts in global warming, says that because of the sins of Alberta, the dirty kind of nature of it, what they often people call extreme oil, because of the extractive nature of getting oil out of the tar sands, is in many ways contributing disproportionately to catastrophic global warming and ecological catastrophe across the globe. All of that is true at the same time, so that we have this particular kind of aporia, a place that all of us, in fact, much of the Canadian Albertan economy resides on, a place that is contributing unequivocally to the well-being of people, and certainly all kinds of people from Cape Breton who travel there, and certainly from my family too, because my daughter, in fact, her life was changed spectacularly. She was, kind of hacking around in bars and cafes, trying to, figure out what she wanted to do with her life. She went there, made an extravagant amount of money, was able to put herself through nursing school, and now for the last 2 years has been working as an emergency room nurse and on COVID wards in a way that I'm incredibly proud of. So our trips, our many trips up through Treaty territory, in particular spending time in two places, in Little Buffalo and Lubicon Cree territory, and in a place called Janvier, which is a reserve just south of Fort Mac, were all designed to try to unsettle our most stuck feelings about global warming and about ecology in general, to try to think through routes that settlers and good people of all kinds who are thinking about and trying to act on global warming. We were trying to shake up our ideas and to try to think of new routes, new ways of thinking that might provide us some kinds of possibilities, some kind of reconstructive possibilities and routes to action. And each time we went on one of these trips, we would come back, and most of the time I was just confused and I wasn't sure what to think or to say, because I had so many things running through my head often. And we would often then come and sit and talk with friends of ours and colleagues, and we relied on some of my closest colleagues and people, well, friends and people that we hang out with and write and rely on in lots of ways, people like Glenn Coulthard and Lena Labucan Massimo, and more than anybody in this book, we spent a ton of time hanging out with Leanne Simpson and trying to think through what we had found and what we were thinking. And we began to develop an analysis around the close connection between the domination of people and the domination of nature, of the other than human world, that those two things are intimately connected to one another. And that so certainly our view of an ecological future is that it has to be an anti-capitalist future, but it has to be more than that, that our analysis of extraction and of exploitation have to be extended beyond the simple surplus labor and the Marxist sense in the word of exploitation, and extended to think about it from a decolonial perspective. Because if really then, that if what we're talking about when we talk about ecology is we're talking about getting into good relations with both humans and the other than human world, the natural world. And that cannot abide by an exploitive framework. That exploitation is a relationship that is primarily designed around self-interest without substantive care for the other. And that in many ways describes certainly capitalism's ethos about our relationship to one another, but absolutely our relationship to the other than human world. And that when you are in the tar sands in Northern Alberta, like so many other locations, like many that Dorene spoke of, the relationship and the exploitive and the extractive nature of that relationship is entirely clear. And that if we were going to try to develop a new rendition of ecology, it has to encounter a real relationship with exploitation and with extractivism. And to do that, to unsettle and to rethink our notions of ecology, I think that we have to engage primarily with the fundamental ontology of this country, which is that of a colonial, extractive, and exploitive relationship to this land and to its First Nations. And so thinking that through then, we kind of sort of in a sideways, we kind of began to think of, we ran into this notion of the sweetness of living. And like much of my writing, and my thinking, I could kind of see it side-eyed. You know, we were encountering a number of Indigenous writers and thinkers from South America, particularly folks who were writing about Buen Viver and Sumac Causay, particularly from Ecuador and Colombia. And we could see this idea of the sweetness of living. And I wasn't sure what it meant, except that when I think about that idea, it is an idea that strikes me as the antipode of exploitation and extractivism. And oftentimes when we were spending time with folks like Glenn and Leanne, I would hear words like about relationality and about good relations. And I can, again, in my kind of narrow settler way of thinking, I can see it and I can kind of sense that idea. And I get a sense of what that might mean, but it takes me a while to kind of come to it and to think of it. And to think of the idea of what relationality looks like. And of course, that has to mean something beyond exploitation. It has to talk about being in relationship with both humans and the other than human world in a way that cannot abide by that kind of domination. And so that began to inform much of our thinking and writing. And it became very clear to us that the exact same politics with which decolonizing claims might be realized, those are the exact same politics needed to confront global warming. The decolonizing claims are inextricably, they're entangled with ecology. And the possibility of that politics then opens us up to a reconstituted understanding of what the sweetness of living might be. And so then when we began to think about trying to redefine ecology, what we were really talking about was a renovated way of being in the world, particularly for settlers like me. That we're absolutely looking for ruptures in capitalist certainties and articulating alternative possible relationships to one another, to other species, to the land. And it's certain that that the exploitive relationships between the colonial state and the land are replicated in every corner of the planet. And that global warming is just one of those consequences. And I do believe that global warming is in fact is not the only ecological peril facing us, of course. And that to think then that if we're legitimately really looking to confront global warming, that requires a politics that speaks to a different way of being in the world, a sensibility that's not governed by shame or anxiety, but in a trying to articulate a sweetness of living. And it strikes me that different way of being in the world has to start with those of us who are doing the most damage and have the most resources to mobilize, people in the global north like me. And the challenge really, I think, for people like me and settlers of my kin are to try to work together to try to understand and try to think through what that sweetness of living might look like. And that strikes me as the plausible route to actually thinking through an ecology that rests on decolonization. That's it. I'm gonna stop there. Thank you, friends. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to pass it on now. My apologies. I need to pass it on here to our commentators. Monika and Bree, stoked to hear what you might think of all this, and thank you for following up on.
Thank you so much for that, Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much. We hadn't planned who might go first. I don't know, Bree, do you want to go ahead? Do you have some initial thoughts? I have notes.
Sure, I have notes too. I'm a note taker too. If I don't take notes, I'm not remembering anything. But we have a few comments here on the side there from Clem. He's thanking Duma for the informative presentation and would like to know the two Mi'kmaq words, the terms that you use, because they keep resonating with him. So if you can say those again up, Duma.
Well, I guess there was a few words and I wrote them in the chat to our organizer. Gimitkinok, that's the one. And Imsid Mimajuwakan. And then you have Ilnuidasink.
Ilnuidasink. Okay.
I was wondering, Duma, you, in the last minute, I know you were running out of time and you said these can be the whole framework for addressing climate change, and that was your last minute. And I wondered if you might say a little bit more around, maybe one of the concepts. I know you talked a little bit more about Mi'kmaq, either expanding on that or if there was another piece that you wanted to say a bit more about, because that was your parting thoughts.
Oh, well, basically, I'm using the treaty model as an example of how we can, begin to address the climate crisis. you know, and that's really the central point on it. We have treaty rights, treaty obligations, treaty diplomacy, and and how do we interpret all these? And if we take that model that governs the relationship between in Ilnus and settlers here in Mi'kmaq, then we can take it and use it as a model to address the climate change by establishing basically a treaty between ourselves and other life forces.
And then we have another one that's extended all to all the panelists here, and it's just a little quotation note there, especially to Duma. Sees laws as a potential route to protect First Nations fishing rights, particularly in respect to Indian Brook's lobster fishery. My opinion, laws are still applied in colonial and assimilist context as per the current rhetoric from our federal government. But might there be a way to use the legal system to defend Indigenous fishing rights, especially using the Donald Marshall Jr. ruling and the 1982 charter evaluating the treaty rights to constitutional rights from Jan? And just to add on to that, it's funny that she utilized Donald Marshall there, and I don't know who said it exactly. I think it might have been you, Duma, but I was actually reading it in one of the books that I picked up for the MBA program that I'm hoping to take. But there was a piece there that I read, and maybe Duma can evaluate on that a bit more. But it says, beginning in the 1970s, the Mi'kmaq began asserting their rights under the peace and friendship treaties through treaty litigation, which continued through the 1980s and 1990s with Simon versus the Queen, and then R versus Denny, and then Donald Marshall's case there. So the 1985 one, that was with David B. Denny, Lawrence John Paul, and Thomas Frank Sillaboy, who possessed the right to fish for food under the 1760 Peace and Friendship Treaty. So it's nice that you also noted that Donald Marshall, he was a key one there. And I love the point where you said that it was for the commercial aspect of fishing. So like Duma has said too, is that there have been a number of court cases, but what emphasized and what got most spotlight was Donald's there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's important to recognize all the laws and all the courts that we've had to take in place in order to get us to where we are today. So if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, Tuma, that'd be great.
Well, there's two parts to this question. What I can think, one is that can we use UNU or indigenous laws in the courts, or have they been used, to try and protect Aboriginal fishing rights, or to help address the climate crisis that we have? The second one was, the history of litigation. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the history of litigation. One of the issues with courts and the court's assertion has been for a long, long time. There was initial court, there's been protest. Grand Chief, Grand Chief Denny, John Denny, when they were trying to move member 2 up from Gundawik up to Alexander Street, he protested. He tried to use a situation. He died, during that claim. And then the same thing happened with when member 2 was moved. The Grand Council protested that, and they tried to use all the proper forms and everything. Didn't work. They lost. It was stacked up against them. Later on, the Grand Chief Sillaboy asserted his case in the 1926 case, R versus Sillaboy, and used the Treaty of 1752 as a defense to his charge of having pelts out of season, hunting out of season. There's a whole book on this. William Wickham wrote a book on that, and you might want to think about that. And then, but that loss resulted in a significant trauma inflicted on Ilnus, and that that court case, and there's a lot of politics associated with that, did not get overturned until 1985. Well, actually, in 1980, when James Matthew Simon was charged 5 years to get him up to the Supreme Court, and the Union of Nova Scotia Indians at the time, now the Union of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq, they took that case, and Bruce Wildsmith was one of the lawyers. He was a young lawyer at the time. Now he's almost retired now. And so they took that case on, but there's been a history of negotiations programming and other court cases and etc. And Isaac case in the 70s, the Denny, the one that you referred there, assertion, and you have Simon, and then you had the Bernard case, Marshall case, and then the Bernard case out of New Brunswick, and so on and so forth. There's been a lot of cases on a lot of topics in trying to advance. One of the difficulties of using Canadian law is that you're in a form that's not really conducive to it. And even the courts have basically said a certain treaty and Aboriginal rights in the courts is not the proper form. It's very difficult because every single one of these cases have been brought forward in a quasi-criminal manner. All the charges are quasi-criminal in nature or quasi-regulatory criminal in nature. Whereas the nature of the claim is not even criminal at all. It's a diplomacy claim, but the way we structure them is through the criminal aspect of it, and that's where you're trying to fit I guess the lack of what is that thing, a square peg in a round hole type of thing, right? No, it just doesn't really work. And lastly, too, bringing Indigenous laws, has been tried. It's never been accepted, never been worked out until recently. We have a little opportunity here, and as with the release of the TRC report, those calls to action have, and I reference, and I think all of us, we should all read those calls to actions as part of helping us address the climate crisis and the environmental thing, because that's all part of it, right? And same with the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Calls to Justice report. We have that, and they indicate that like for example, 27, 28 are direct calls to actions to the legal profession to make sure every single lawyer is culturally competent in Indigenous laws, Aboriginal rights, UNDRIP, and very other things. Now, cultural competency is a soft landing spot. That's makes everybody feel very comfortable. I'm competent in. I know about the Mi'kmaq. I know about the Haudenosaunee. I know about the Musqueam and everything like that. Well, if we have to bite the tongue and start there, then we get them there. Some of them will move on and become culturally healing, or even reconciliation, and then eventually maybe we can move them up to decolonization. And I'm reminded of the harm reduction model that we used to use back in the late 1980s when I was doing my training in San Francisco on, and how harm reduction was seen then versus how it's seen today. So, but that's another life, right? So part of it now is the challenges that the courts, lawyers, and lawmakers are saying, okay, we'll think about bringing in Indigenous law. What is it? Where is it located? I cannot find a citation. It's in the language, it's in the songs, it's in the ceremonies, it's in the rituals, it's in the protocol, it's in those treaties, it's in those things. Yes, it's not in a form, but doesn't mean it's not legal, it's not valid. And I tell them, just because it doesn't follow the McGill citation code, it's cited in the petroglyphs at Kejimkujik. You
Powerful.
just have to read it, And so now, then they call upon like folks like myself. Okay, Tuma, you tell us, you teach us. So I'm running around doing judicial education, lawyer education, cultural, and not unlike many of us doing treaty education. There's a whole whack of people trained to go and speak in October, where people are doing education to the business community, but business is also saying we need to know this because there's some issues here. We're not making as much money as we should, and what's wrong? What do we have to do? What's this consultation bit? How much money do we have to drop into Sibiganiagadi to make them pass this? Right? If that's what it was, then well, let's get the checkbook out. Do we have to write a scholarship? Do we have to build a building? It's not that, So we have to do some education. And So that's what I said. Every single one of us has an obligation to do this. And in every single one of us is doing the same thing, whether it's direct activism at the source or briefcase lawyers, or even in the decolonizing in the health system, or even in the university where we have at CBU, we have indigenization and what we also term Ulnuization. Well, it's one thing to say it, to work at it is the hard stuff. We can make all the statements we want, but then it's in the review of all our policies, processes, and stuff. It's like systemic racism, systemic discrimination. You see a lot of people with their statements, but it's the reviews that's needed. How do you do your disciplinary? How do you do your admissions into universities? How do we make the environmental movement more inclusive, more favorable? And for new people, how do we make them, yes, the soft landing game, culturally competent, and move them to strong environmental activists? Because, and we cannot forget about, Matt talked about the workers, and stuff like this. Many of the workers in the tar sands projects and even indigenous communities out there, they know it's a problem, but they feel powerless or small and everything. So part of the work to do is how do we use our indigenous knowledge to empower them, to make choices. And the basic choice is to remind us that, we all have an obligation, we all have a responsibility, in whatever, and to do whatever we need to do. So,
I feel like that's a really good link to bring in everyone else who's been speaking tonight. So I'm going to have everyone come into the main stage if we could. Maybe now that that link was made back to what Matt had been talking about, we don't have any immediate questions at this point. So I think we'll just kind of keep going
We
with
have a comment here there, Monika. Consultation seems to be the opposite of treaty, of diplomacy, because it is based on the principle that that only one side has the right to say no, the domination side, and she wants thoughts on that. And I love that she put that there, and I love what Tuma keeps talking about, the cultural aspect of it. And for me, what the title I used was always cultural sensitivity. And the reason why I use that term for myself is that we are educating non-Ulnu. I don't use settler. I don't use any other term. I don't believe in calling people by a race. There's Ulnu and then there's non-Ulnu in my point of view. And that's what I was taught from one of my elders, Eleanor Johnson. You are Ulnu and then there's non-Ulnu. So with that being said, I think that's so perfect to start on that piece there with cultural sensitivity, because that's the only way that we're going to have a solid foundation of building decolonization. We have to show these people, this is who we are, this is where we come from, these are the events that happened in our life. Our children in this generation today are feeling the trauma that we have faced, and it's genetically given to them. And that's another place that we have to acknowledge too, is that we have this intergenerational trauma. And Dorene touched on that. And I am a true advocate for that because it is real. And I've said that today too in one of my meetings, is that it was studied that a fourth generation, regardless of where it is, the fourth generation feels that trauma the most. They are the ones who are going to stop and say, you know what, this trauma is done. We need to fix the past, the present, and the future. So right now today, I'm the fourth generation of my family. And I can attest to that too as well, is that this generation, we have felt the trauma beyond means. And we are in a place where we are saying, okay, what do we do to not only make this world a better place, but how do we leave it a better place for the next 7 generations to come? And I loved what Matt said, because that was important too, about he emphasized that he has a daughter who works out west, works out into the tar sands there. And she felt helpless, that she was contributing to somewhere that she knew was not the greatest, but it was also offering her a better avenue to life. And that's what people are seeing. They may not necessarily want to do something cruel to our world. They have no choice. And I love that Duma said that, because there are people who do feel small. And I go back to what my Elder Johnson told me before, is that Ulnu may feel small, but the only way that we can empower them is through education. And the most powerful Ulnu on this planet is one that is educated and can never be broken down. So warriors inspire me about the politics of hope. That was from Paul there. So if you guys can elaborate a bit more on that too, because I see a couple students here that are in a couple of the courses that we offer with CBU. So I'm very proud of you all for being here today and showing up. It just shows your guys' eager and willingness to learn more about how to make this world a better place. So please, thank you for being here today. So I'm a blabber. Somebody take this from me, because I'll take the whole night.
I wonder if anybody wants to comment on that first comment that Bree had started with around consultation being the opposite of much of what Duma had talked about. Maybe I'll just ask Dorene as a starting point. Is there anything you might want to say about that? Or you're on mute.
Well, you know, I think that the biggest problem is that there hasn't been consultation, and within our own, amongst our own people, you know, and when we find ourselves, you know, against, you know, some decision, you know, like any of these projects that are, you know, put our lives at risk, put our water, our land, our resources, and the future, our future generations, their survival at risk. I think it is our responsibility, and it's all our responsibility, not just Indigenous people, but where it is our land. This is we're responsible. We're responsible for our Mother Earth wherever we are, and I think the problem with the consultation is in Mi'kmaq is that it's done much farther down the line, you know, before, I mean, after a lot of the decisions have already been made. And they don't take our rights into consideration. They don't take our, of course they know that we're going to push back, and we're going to have to, you know, to oppose something. And they just try to push these permits and things through, and as much money invested into something, so that it's almost like beyond the, you know, can't turn back, or they invested too much money now. It's like, you know, the free trade agreement, you know, like, I don't know, a lot of these things that they're doing here is like I said, 7 years into this project, when we finally find out, we even find out about the project. You know, I mean, if they had told us what their plans were for the river, you know, and what they wanted to do back then, we would have opposed it then, and they wouldn't have to spend a dime, you know, and but they didn't do that. So we're at this place now where everything's built and everything's ready, and all they got to do is push a button, you know, to start something. And of course, we're not going to let that happen, because they broke their own laws. They broke their own environmental laws. So if the laws that are already in place are not protecting the environment or the water, or the you know, the species at risk, and all the, you know, all the life that the Environmental Act is supposed to take care of, then, you know, there's got to be changes to the way they're doing things, and they need to be called out. And, you know, I mean, they need to be called out for breaking their own laws. And we have laws too. I told them we have laws. We have Nadudalimk. We have you know, we have Indigenous laws that tells us, you know, to take care of our land and water, and respect all life, and to stand up for those that don't have a voice. You know, we talked about the flyers and the swimmers and the crawlers and the trees and everything. Our children and our grandchildren that can't speak for themselves. and even the future generations. So I think when they talk about consultation, and that really bothers me, that that consultation is a checkbox. It's not true, in the spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of UNDRIP, or even our own, like I said, our own laws. It's done as an exercise, and they have other people speaking for us without consulting us. Our own people have let us down, because had we known, had they come to the communities and told us where we were on this project and what was at risk, and there was no impact benefit agreement. There was no, they called that a mutual benefit agreement. They even changed the name of it. There's nothing to do with the impacts on the environment, our lives, and our treaty or anything. It was talking about, mutual benefit, what you're going to get out of this and what we're going to get out of this, and we'll just agree on that. And it really upset me that, it upset many of us, that we weren't consulted and we weren't brought into this much later, into this, and not only this project, this talks about all the, projects across the board, including Goldboro. Like, we were at Treaty Day on the wharf in Saulnieville when they made this announcement that they bought into this company. They have a company that's going to provide the services to this man camp. I mean, a lot of the things, and had we known that, we could have talked about that. But it was like on a, they make announcements and then it just goes right by, like it's already been done. Like, where are the women? Where are the water, the defenders? Where are our warriors, our land defenders and water protectors, and the women on this issue? What is the voice? So then I hear that they're planning, to write policy, safety policy for the people who are going to be working at this man camp, rather than even talking to us to say, what are the impacts of the missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada, and the impacts of people who are impacted by these man camps, and what have we learned from that, and why are we just we're not even being asked. They're doing it without our input, So I mean, that's a lot of the things that I think as elders and as women, grandmothers, and as water protectors, land defenders, and people who stand up for the women across our nation, I think that we need to be involved not only with the government, the federal government or the provincial government, our own Indigenous governments as well.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I think what you said kind of fits really nicely into a comment that has also been submitted, because clearly a lot of the current system by kind of colonizing governments is not working. So the comment that was made is around how so much of the kind of worldviews and approaches that have been put forward by many of the speakers is around the importance of human interrelationships. But we have this hierarchy that's been created by colonizing governments, and the question is around how, if we can't have faith in government just saying that they will take responsibility, as they should by the legacy of treaty, and the fact that global warming won't go away once everyone is treated equally, then what is our next steps? And I'm wondering, maybe to bring Matt into the conversation a bit, because you talked a lot about kind of the exploitative relationships that exist in ecology and in worldviews, in I think how these relationships are structured between governments and Indigenous peoples and nations. maybe if you have any comments around then, how do we change this current structure? How do we shift this worldview, maybe from your perspective? And then it'd be nice to bring in others into the conversation if there are other comments.
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask too big a question, Monika. Thank you. I think let me see if I can just answer like this. This is a tiny bit tangential, but there was the youth project that I ran before this one was a large youth center in East Vancouver with a couple of hundred kids that came through on a regular basis. And over the years, as it kind of got some kind of profile, there were a number of people over the years, an accelerating number of people over the years who wanted to come and visit. And we were contacted by a lot of researchers, by academics, by graduate students, by researchers of all kinds, people who wanted to come and study, young Indigenous street engaged youth. They wanted to study young pregnant mothers. They wanted to study Latinx community members who were engaged in like anything. There was, and especially in the lead up of the time around the Olympics, it was particularly intense, And there was always some academic, they wanted to come in and they wanted to study something or do a focus group or interview some kids or do something, and every single time I balked. And I was like, well, okay, that's cool that you want to come in and you want to write a paper or do a study or something that's going to, significantly further your career or your profile. But like, what's in it for the young people here? What do they get out of it? And I mean, every time and time again, people will be like, oh yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay, I'm not sure. How about if we held a focus group and we gave everybody $20 Starbucks cards? And I was like, well, I mean, all right. But, you're making $100 grand a year and this is your academic career. Like, give them some $20 gift card. I was like, that doesn't feel like any kind of reciprocity here. That doesn't feel like a relationship to me. That feels extractive. And I'd be like, what could you what could be a substantial relationship? And people would be like, well, I don't know, I'd be like, well, maybe you could come and teach a class, or maybe you could come and do some work with us. And maybe if you came and was part of our thing, then maybe you could write from your perspective instead of trying to extract information from these young people. And I have to tell you that over 10 years, I didn't get a single person taking me up on my offer. Because I kept saying, well, great, if you can come up with a proposal that feels fair and reciprocal, then of course, we'd love to have you. We love having guests and we're really proud of our project. And not a single person would take me up. They'd be like, I'm too busy, or I don't know how to make it, I don't have time for that, or I don't know how to I don't know how to run a class, or, and I was like, that's okay, you don't even know how to run a class. Honestly, this place is filthy. I'd love you to come and clean our bathrooms and help me. Please, what's some kind of fair thing we can come to? And I never got a single person taking me up. Except for this one guy. He was a education researcher from I think it's from UBC. I can't remember actually now. The guy's name was John, and he said, I'm a carpenter. Would that be helpful? And I was like, oh, you don't even know. It'd be so helpful. This place is like a filthy punk house. I'd love you to come and we need doors fixed, and we need shelves built, and we need there's any number of things that we need done around here. That'd be great. That seems super great. That seems like a fair trade. And he said, okay, cool. And then I said, he came in on Saturday mornings, and I said, listen, but if any kids want to work with you, just show them stuff. I don't want to make it a class or whatever, but if anybody wants to learn carpentry skills, hang out with them. And so every Saturday for a while, he said, great, I'll do it. And then there's three young people, in their, late teens, who kind of adhered around him. And for a bunch of Saturdays, they just would go around and they would fix stuff and build stuff in the center. And he would teach them skills, and they would hang out and they would do stuff. And frankly speaking, I kind of forgot about him after a while. I was like, oh yeah, because I wasn't in there on Saturdays all that often. And then after a while, I remembered him, and I was like, oh, hey, whatever happened with that research you were going to do about the purple thistle, about our studies? And he said, So I never really did it, you know. He said after a while, after I was hanging out there and being with all those kids, it just didn't feel right to write about them like that. It felt weird to make them an object of study. Like it just didn't fit. So I just wrote something else. And that's kind of a long way, a kind of a story of getting around, is that in that story, I can sense like the notion of some kind of relationality, right? And I don't mean that in the kind of crass transactional sense of reciprocity. I do mean reciprocity, but I mean something more than that, right? Is this notion and everybody, like we all know and we feel it, we hate it when we're being consulted. When you know you're gonna like ask my opinion and do whatever the hell you feel like anyways. That's exactly that feeling that you'll get it sometimes, like in various kinds of ways. And it just feels gross, right? It's like we all know what that feels like. And that particular kind of thing, it speaks to that lack of, that inability to form legitimate kind of relationships, right? And that constant deferment to extractivism that's so endemic in academic research across all fields, right? And that Indigenous people and racialized people of all kinds have been suffering for generations at the hands of white academics, on the premise that somehow there's some kind of like, greater good or benefit, when really the main benefit is for people's careers. And so I think it befits us to ask those kind of questions. When people speak of consultation, like what are we really talking about that? Are we really talking about a substantive, respectful relationship? Or are we just talking about something like Dorene said, just something you got to fill out the damn box so you can keep doing what you're going to do anyways? And I think I think to interrogate those kind of rhetorics that continually get invoked by every level of government in all of us and are subject, certainly around land consultations. Like actually, you have no interest in my opinion. You have no substantive interest in either my welfare nor my opinion. And there is no question about my opinion actually changing the way you're thinking. And so I think we actually begin to to interrogate the nomenclature that gets used and that rhetoric that gets invoked, certainly in legalistic terms and always around land. And to ask, like, really in a very, just a kind of an everyday way, like, what the hell do you mean by that? And overwhelmingly, what they mean by that is, well, I'm just trying to look to carry on doing what I'm doing here. And I think that my route into that is to think that through what I would consider like colonial ontologies of exploitation and extraction that I spoke of before, right? To think that through and to try to find those and disembed those in all our relationships as certainly as settlers, but in particular as white people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was good.
Stephen,
Go ahead, Bree.
what are your thoughts on all this? What do you think that we can do as people to better not only our environment, but ourselves?
You weren't asking me that, were you?
Nope, I'm asking
Oh.
Stephen.
You're asking me?
Bugging him.
Yes. I mean, for me, I mean, it's a whole issue of, government power versus indigenous freedom. I mean, we're not the ones that are power hungry or power oriented. We just see our knowledge systems as our mind is free and we can say the things we want to say, and we say it in a collective context. There are these other issues too: colonialism, colonization, stewardship. I mean, it's not even an indigenous terminology. If anything, it's a Christian terminology about people looking after the land and being above animals and creatures. I was way back many years ago, I was working with the United Nations on a Convention on Biodiversity. And we were gathered together somewhere in Madrid, Spain. And the Canadian guys, we had a big team of Canadians represented by a government guy speaking on the rest of Canada, that even the Indigenous people didn't have a voice. And in the evening when we got together, one of the guys who was part of Department of Environment Canada, he said, Stephen, he said, you know, you guys are supposed to be protecting the environment. He said, but I traveled up north and I said, it's a mess up there. Your people, he says, were they're dumping canoes, motors, engines, quads, whatever, uh, big metal cans of oil and gas and all that stuff, and you guys just drop it there and leave it there. What, you're not looking after Mother Earth that way. And I said, well, if you go back maybe 100 or 200 years up in that northern area, I said, our people, you call, they, when they're done with a kayak made out of skin and bone and sinew and wood, they put it, they leave it in their backyard. Mother Earth is going to claim it back. Same with all kinds of our whatever we got from Mother Earth, from all the elements, birds, plants, animals, and fish, whatever grows and whatever's around us. And I said, that mentality is an old ideology that's still resident in our people's philosophy. And so you introduce glass, you introduce metal, copper, whatever, aluminum, and all of those things. They're brought in from outside. They're brought into our communities. And when we are done with them, our elders are not educated about the breakdown quality of glass and metal and all those things. So they park them in the back thinking, well, Mother Earth will claim them back. And when those things are brought up north, there's no return policy to send them back down. There's no money being spent on taking those things back down and recycling them in some way. So I said, the ideology about stewards of the land, I mean, if anything, it's Mother Earth that's taking care of us, not the other way around. I said, can you control a tsunami or a landslide or an earthquake? We're just little tiny iota instruments of on Mother Earth, and we rely mostly on our spirituality for trying to maintain a good balance, and we're always asking, you know, spare us, save us, keep the animals here. We're making friends with the animals. We have treaties with the animals and the birds and the fish and those things, and we transfer those agreements to people, our neighbors. And so I think it's in thinking about biodiversity, the economy, how we treat Mother Earth, and I think there's like what Tuma said and Matt and Dorene. I mean, the emphasis is teaching the public about who we are, where we come from, and who they are, and we all experienced this history together. We witnessed it. It all happened with all of us around. So it's not one side that should be dictating to the other side. And this is the problem with colonialism. Anyway, that's my thoughts anyway for now.
Gladiag.
I'm just going to jump in. One more point that I want to make, and that's you know, the concept of allyship. You know, we need to find allies anywhere that we can find them. You know, and not necessarily focus on the personalities or the people that we think about. Because sometimes when we're very passionate about many things, and I'm just as passionate, as you can tell by my presentation here, passionate about a lot of things. I don't want to ever slip into the position of blaming folks or attacking folks for anything that they may do. You know, whether it's Justin Trudeau, you know, Stephen Harper, or you know, or the Jagmeet Singh, or like even, you know, our local politicians here, or the chief and councils. You know, in some ways, it's not the person it's the system. And we need to focus on, changing the system. I'm reminded constantly, and often tell people that one time I was down in Arizona and I was appointed guardian ad litem for the court down there, tribal court. And I walked in and I was handling a child custody dispute between a divorcing couple. Well, the court was on the reserve. The judge was a tribal member. The mother was a tribal member. The father was a tribal member. The clerks were tribal members. The lawyers were tribal members, with the exception of me. And it was a beautiful courthouse on the tribal reserve. And so I asked, well, what is your child custody code, your traditional child custody code? And they gave it to me, and I was supposed to go away and make a report on what I asked the guardian ad litem, what I think would be the best outlook care. And I came back and I looked at this child custody code and I said, geez, this looks kind of familiar. So I went to the law library at the University of Arizona and I looked up the state of Arizona code, word for word. They just scratched out state of Arizona and put in their community. And I thought, sometimes all they did was they put brown faces in a Western institution, and they expect it to change. No matter how good the people are, no matter how, the fundamental thing is that we're still doing the same oppression. So in some ways, when we put our leaders, when we put our chief and councils in place, we keep thinking we change them, but it's not them. So I never blame chief and council. I never blame the mayors or the councilors. I never blame the politicians. It's the structures in place that needs to change. And that's where the true advocacy needs to happen, is that how do we want this action? And that's where we start. One of my greatest things, I once met up with Laureen Harper, the wife of Stephen Harper. We were at this event and, she's a very much of a nature advocate, but who knows? And she did a lot about keeping cats indoors and protecting birds from the cats and everything like this. And she teamed up with Margaret Atwood. And we were at this event where a lot of rich people come and, they sign and donate money to nature projects all over. And she was very adamant about protecting the rights of women on reserve, because she had a personal connection to it. And I found an ally there. You would think a conservative and myself, and that thing, and, if I had approached that and saying, no, there's no way we can be together on this, we talked about it. And that from there on, there was the matrimonial real property interest on reserves came about. And I was like, that served to protect women's interest on rights. And that's, a lot of it had to go back to Laureen Harper. And I thought, wow, there's, you can find allyship in places. And the thing is that we need to work together and focus on the systems. And I guess that's about it. That's it. I lost all steam now.
I love hearing from everyone. I love hearing everybody's thoughts and views on what they believe is the best step forward. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank Monika for helping me out with this too as well. So we've been notified that we have to pass it back to our co-hosts, Terry and Ekian, for our closing.
Thank you so much. And it's so hard to end this discussion.
It is, it really is.
It feels like almost very difficult. I do want to say to people that please, if there are ideas or thoughts that you have about the discussion tonight that you'd like to see us sort of have a future panels talks about, please do let us know. And just from the bottom of my heart, to thank everybody for coming and being really fully present here with us tonight for this discussion and bringing so many interesting perspectives. And I just have so many different notes that have come out of this discussion tonight, little gems. As I listen to Stephen and he talks about the earth and our relationship to the earth, I'm thinking, wow, this is what's happening in the discussions with geologists and scientists who are talking about the Anthropocene and all of this stuff. And they're, they're saying the same kinds of things, but, the settlers are a bit slower. We were like, oh yeah, but can I prove this in my article? What is the science? And, our Indigenous brothers and sisters have been telling us this for a long time, but that we're an earth system, the animals, the humans, the plants, everything is interconnected and interrelated, and so beautifully articulated by Stephen. And the message from Dorene about the voice for the life that does not have voice, and how do we do that? How do we practically do that in our allyship? And Duma's very sort of generous and compassionate way of thinking about working with some of our unexpected allies. And while I agree with Duma very much, one level, I do think that individuals within these institutions and structures, like Duma himself, that have the bravery to kind of step outside the bounds sometimes and to say, you know what, things need to change here. And those of us who find ourselves at institutions and places where we have a voice and we have the capacity to try to push for things to be different, then, to be allies, how do we do that? So it is those structures, but it's also us in the here and now in the trenches of the institutions that we've got. And what do we do today in them, in that meeting that we go to at 9 o'clock in the morning, in that whatever that we're engaged in. So thanks to Duma for making us think about that. And Matt for, relationality beyond exploitation, extraction, and seeing our climate change discussions through that lens of decolonization. How powerful is that when we begin to talk about decolonization and then go back to those starting points of breaking down the structures, violent structures, genocidal structures, and see how they're reflected in all the sort of micro violence that happens within institutions, even in contemporary times. So thank you for that. Yeah, I could go on about what everybody has said, but I just want to thank all our speakers very much for their contributions and for bringing so much wisdom to us today. And I'll hand it to Stephen to say his final words.
I also appreciate the diversity of opinions and viewpoints and the allyship that's out there. I really appreciate what Duma calls non-Ulnu or Bree, non-Ulnu people, but it's still a label. But I think for me, I mean, we're part of a human family, and I kind of cringe when I hear the word law. I mean, but I think ethics and morals, I think, and principles are key elements to humanity, and I'm finding that some of the what I learned from my own creation story when I'm telling it, I mean, things jump at me when I'm beginning to tell my story, and I don't have a script. It's always up here, and who I see out there in the crowd governs on how I tell the story. And in a lot of instances, like my aversion to that terminology of law, I mean, I look to the children that are looking at us, and so we have to govern ourselves in a way that we leave a legacy of survival for those kids. I mean, it doesn't take one culture to determine whether that's good or bad. I mean, it's a reality, it's a humanity. And I think the world needs more open-mindedness towards the diversity that we have in the world, as well as those natural elements of that are within our heart, the meaning of love, caring for people. It's a very strong component, and I stand a lot of times always for the underdog. They always say, people that are not treated well by. You can have all different kind of labels for it. I mean, right-leaning, whatever, peoples that kind of push on the but I like Matt's philosophy, I guess I could call it, and it's organization and community. People influence. They can influence. A lot of people can influence governments too. They've even broken down governments. I mean, like the Arab Spring that happened, but it didn't go off too well. I guess it wasn't well managed after. And images of these kind of things are happening around the world. In Myanmar now, I mean, it's problematic. But I think venues like this, the coming together of minds, diversity, universities, communities, organizations. I mean, Matt was telling us his main driving force, I mean, is community action. And I've seen it. I mean, I met him up in Whitehorse at Yukon College. I mean, he comes strolling in there. I was expecting this white guy to walk in with a three-piece suit and a necktie, and here he came in with a t-shirt. It was awesome, but I couldn't stop taking notes, and his connection with Ivan Illich, I mean, who's been a major influencer in the way I think. Anyway, so I really appreciate, and people like Duma. I mean, I sometimes think the Mi'kmaq Grand Council should give him a PhD in law, and a PhD in Indigenous history, a PhD in diversity. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that our Indigenous nation can bestow on our people to recognize their accomplishments. And why do we have to wait in line? And why do we have to be pushed aside and indigenize the university? I mean, it's I've been at it since 1975, and it's I like Tuma said, 3 steps forward, 2 back, and so on and so forth. I mean, our court cases and all of that. I mean, but I really appreciate to be able to speak up and to be heard and to engage with like-minded individuals out there. And I appreciate this session tonight. I appreciate Matt and Duma and Darlene, Bree, Monika. Monika, flown on the airplane, I don't know how many times with her and her son, sometimes from Toronto or Ottawa to Halifax, and Halifax to here in Sydney. And then she moved away. I mean, we were together when we were doing the Syrian refugee thing. Anyway, so I also appreciate that she's back in Cape Breton. I haven't met her personally since she's been back, but nice to see you tonight, Monika. Yeah, that's all I will say.
Okay, on that note, we will close, everyone, and thanks to you, the audience, for being here and for taking time. We know everybody's busy and has lots going on in their lives, so we really, really genuinely appreciate that you came here to be with us, to listen to our speakers, and hopefully that you take these messages away and do what you're going to do to help this process of decolonization moving forward. So thanks, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next Politics of Hope event coming up.
I forgot to mention Catalina.
Catalina and Suvir, thank you.
Yes.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tech people in the background, Catalina Belalcazar and Suvir Singh, who have been silently and wonderfully working in the background to make everything for tonight work and run smoothly with respect and with careful planning and thinking and all the publicity and everything. So thank you so much to both of them. Okay, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Love you.
Nibeki sakeiko chimikwe tuwenimiko kijawenimiko 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 Samgwan gesalu Samgwan welale Samgwan get me delmo 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 Samgwan not mi majo.